The system, once so confident in its control, was learning humility. No confrontation, no declaration of supremacy, simply a quiet assertion of power through action. Every meeting, every contract, every handshake now carried a different weight. The conversation had shifted. The question was no longer if he would comply, but how they could accommodate the reality he had already created. This is the essence of authority transferred, not through force, not through spectacle, but through mastery of circumstance, through proof layered upon proof until resistance becomes irrelevant. Can you see the subtle satisfaction of vindication, the kind that requires no boast, no explanation, because the results speak louder than any argument? Hollywood, built on expectation and precedent, found itself dependent on the very individual it had once sought to contain. And with that dependency came respect, recognition, and a recalibration of power that was irreversible. It wasn't about revenge, it was about inevitability. The industry's adaptation to him became a mirror of a broader truth. Influence belongs to those who create conditions rather than those who demand them, who act with skill and patience rather than obedience. Every studio seeking collaboration, every partner seeking input, every project greenlit on his terms was a testament to the quiet dominance of consistent, disciplined action over hierarchy and protocol. This is what winning looks like. Not spectacle, not public triumph, but the subtle shift where the world aligns itself with your vision because you have demonstrated its inevitability. And in that alignment, there is freedom, not arrogance, authority, not chaos, recognition, not conflict. For anyone who has ever felt constrained by expectation, overlooked by gatekeepers, or pressured to conform, Clint's journey shows a path. Build value, prove it consistently, act with integrity, and the world eventually adjusts to you. The system may have seemed unassailable, but power, when earned quietly and relentlessly, always finds a way to reverse the odds. And in that reversal lies the ultimate lesson. The world does not reward those who ask politely. It responds to those who act decisively, who demonstrate worth, and who let success quietly dictate the terms. The industry came back, but this time it was on his terms, and the echo of that choice continues to resonate far beyond any single film or contract, a blueprint of authority achieved without confrontation, a lesson in the enduring power of action over compliance. When we look back at that moment, the walkout appears less like a single career decision and more like a turning point that reshaped an entire industry. What had seemed like defiance, even recklessness at the time, now reads as vision, a quiet assertion that one person could alter expectations without shouting, without confrontation, without spectacle. Clint's exit was not merely about one role or one studio, it was a statement about the value of self-determination, the power of foresight, and the courage to act on principle before the world recognizes the necessity. How often do we hesitate, waiting for permission or validation, forgetting that opportunity belongs first to those willing to bear risk? By refusing to comply with a system designed to dictate behavior, he created a precedent that still resonates decades later. Autonomy is not only possible, it is transformative. Each film he produced, each calculated decision, each subtle victory became part of a larger narrative, a proof that strategic independence compounds over time, shaping perception, control, and influence. In that sense, his story is not confined to Hollywood. It reflects any arena where conformity is rewarded and imagination deferred. What does it mean to leave a mark not through force, not through recognition, but through consistent, principled action that others eventually must reckon with? The legacy lies in the long-term consequences, the pathways opened for future creators, the recalibration of authority, the subtle but profound reordering of opportunity itself. To walk away from comfort, from expectation, from an imposed path is to claim freedom in its rawest form. It is a reminder that influence and respect are earned over time through repeated acts of integrity and skill, not through appeasement. And so the industry that once defined him found itself responding to his terms, decades of proof converging into an undeniable lesson. Independence is the ultimate currency, and those who cultivate it quietly, patiently, persistently become the architects of their own legacy. Can we see ourselves in that moment? Can we imagine the courage required to walk away from the known, to endure doubt, to act without immediate recognition, trusting that time and consistency will validate the choice? Clint's decision was both intensely personal and universally instructive. It teaches that power is not merely granted by hierarchy, but claimed through deliberate, principled action. It shows that long-term thinking, courage, and self-trust can bend even the most rigid structures. And it reminds us, decades later, that the ripples of one act of independence extend far beyond the individual, inspiring others to recognize that they too can shape their own terms, their own paths, and ultimately their own legacy. The walkout was not an end, it was the beginning of a transformation whose effects endure, a quiet revolution proving that the rules of the world are mutable when met with vision, discipline, and courage, and that true authority is earned not by compliance, but by consistent, unwavering assertion of one's principles.
The room went quiet in a way that makes powerful people uneasy. The kind of silence where no one wants to be first to speak because the truth might land too hard. Executives shifted in their seats, not angry yet, but afraid. Afraid that what they'd just seen couldn't be fixed, softened, or safely sold. Afraid that the ending refused to behave. And in that moment, every expectation they had about control started to crack. Because this wasn't just a movie choice, it was a threat to the rules they lived by. You could feel the imbalance instantly. On one side, an industry trained to smooth edges and protect comfort. On the other, a man who wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't defending himself loudly or explaining his genius. He was calm, still, almost detached, which made it worse. Calm is dangerous when everyone else is panicking. This is the moment most people back down. This is where careers quietly bend. But Clint didn't rush to save anyone's feelings, including his own. He let the tension sit there, unanswered, forcing a single question into the room. If the ending changes, what does any of this actually mean to you now? I want you to understand how unlikely this film really was, because nothing about it fit the moment Clint Eastwood was standing in. By the early 90s, Westerns were considered dead, not quietly resting, but commercially radioactive. Studios believed audiences had moved on, and Clint himself was already a legend who didn't need to prove anything. That's what made this choice dangerous. When you're already respected, the real risk isn't failure, it's ruining the legacy people have already decided to protect for you. The script for Unforgiven had been around for years, passed over again and again because it refused to comfort anyone. It didn't glorify violence, didn't reward virtue, didn't even offer a hero you could safely admire. Clint saw it early, and he waited. Not because he lacked courage, but because timing matters when truth is involved. He knew he wasn't ready yet, and he knew the world wasn't ready either. Waiting became part of the gamble. By the time he finally committed, the stakes were higher than they would have been a decade earlier. He was older, slower, and carrying the weight of everything he'd already represented on screen. Every past role whispered expectations into this one. This wasn't a comeback story or a reinvention play. It was something quieter and more frightening. It was a man choosing to confront his own myth, knowing that myths don't like being challenged. From a distance, it looked unnecessary. Why risk being misunderstood so late in the game? Why reopen questions that success had already answered for him? But that's where the real pressure lives. When people expect you to repeat yourself, choosing honesty feels reckless. Clint wasn't chasing relevance, he was chasing accuracy, and accuracy rarely feels safe. This film shouldn't have existed because it asked the wrong questions for its time. It demanded patience in an era leaning toward spectacle. It asked viewers to sit with discomfort instead of resolution. And Clint knew all of that going in. He knew this wasn't a bet you place to win quickly. It was the kind of bet you make when you care more about what lasts than what lands today. And once that decision was made, there was no version of this story that didn't carry real consequences. And this is where the quiet danger becomes personal for you, because the safest path is almost always the loudest one offered. People will celebrate consistency, reward familiarity, and call it wisdom. But there comes a point when protecting what you've built starts to cost more than risking it. Clint understood that moment intimately. He chose to carry the weight of doubt now rather than regret later. That choice doesn't look brave from the outside. It looks stubborn, inconvenient, even foolish. Yet over time, those are often the decisions that age the best, because they're rooted in self-respect instead of approval. And in the long run, that difference changes everything, especially when silence replaces applause and certainty gives way to earned meaning.
What frightened executives wasn't a single violent moment or a controversial choice. It was the absence of relief. The ending didn't do what endings are trained to do. It didn't reassure. It didn't clarify who was right. It didn't offer a moral bow to tie things together. It simply stopped, leaving behind consequences without instruction on how to feel about them. And for people whose job depends on predicting comfort, that kind of silence is terrifying. Hollywood is built on expectations, and this ending quietly dismantled all of them. The man audiences were conditioned to trust doesn't evolve into something better. He doesn't learn a lesson that redeems his past. He commits acts that feel wrong, then walks away without punishment or praise. There's no cinematic permission slip telling the viewer when to exhale. You're left holding the weight yourself, and studios know most people don't like being left alone with weight. From a business perspective, that uncertainty feels dangerous. Executives imagine audience members shifting uncomfortably in their seats, leaving theaters unsure what they just witnessed, struggling to explain it to friends. They hear complaints before they exist. They see refunds, bad word of mouth, and headlines questioning why a Clint Eastwood film refused to behave like a Clint Eastwood film. The fear isn't that the ending is bad. The fear is that it can't be categorized. What's missing is exactly what unsettles them. There's no triumphant music cue that signals victory, no quiet scene of reflection that implies growth, no final image that reassures you this violence led somewhere meaningful. Instead, there's moral ambiguity that refuses to collapse into comfort. That negative space forces the audience to confront something they'd rather outsource to the story itself. And when stories stop doing the emotional work for us, they feel risky. Executives are trained to protect against that risk by smoothing edges. They believe audiences need guidance, clarity, and a sense of emotional safety when they leave. This ending offered none of that. It trusted viewers to sit with discomfort, to argue with themselves on the drive home, to feel unsettled rather than satisfied. From a creative standpoint, that's honest. From a corporate standpoint, it feels like sabotage. And here's the part most people miss.
The ending didn't scream rebellion. It didn't announce itself as bold or shocking. It was quiet, restrained, almost indifferent to approval. That calm refusal to perform is what made it unbearable. When something breaks the rules loudly, it can be dismissed. When it breaks them silently, it threatens the entire system built around predictability. That's why the ending terrified them, not because it was violent, but because it was unresolved. Not because it was dark, but because it refused to explain the darkness away. It trusted the audience with the truth and asked nothing in return. And for an industry built on managing reactions, that kind of trust feels like losing control. You ever find yourself in a situation where everyone around you is convinced there's only one safe path and every instinct in your body is telling you something else? That was Clint Eastwood in that screening room, and the stakes weren't small. This wasn't a casual disagreement about creative preference. It was the collision of two worlds, the measured, predictable universe of commerce and the untamed, uncompromising realm of truth. On one side, executives whose careers were built on managing risk, protecting investments, and ensuring audiences left theaters feeling comfortable. On the other, a man who had spent decades learning the cost of compromise and the weight of honesty. What would you do if you were asked to dilute the truth for comfort, to swap meaning for a check mark on a spreadsheet? That's the question he faced, and the answer required more than courage. It demanded clarity. When the discussion began, it wasn't loud, it wasn't theatrical. The tension was quiet, dense, almost imperceptible at first. Every word measured, every pause calculated, because escalation doesn't need shouting, it needs restraint. Clint spoke in a voice that didn't beg approval, didn't invite debate. He simply framed the choice. Either the film remains exactly as intended, or it ceases to exist in its true form. That binary, that razor-sharp line crystallized the stakes immediately. There was no middle ground, no compromise that wouldn't dilute the essence of what the film was meant to say. For the executives, trained to find solutions and minimize risk, this was an uncomfortable mirror. Could they accept that losing control sometimes preserves something far greater than profit? The power imbalance became tangible in that room. Clint wasn't trying to dominate. He wasn't seeking confrontation. He wasn't even seeking permission. He was simply asserting what he knew to be right, and in doing so, he shifted the dynamic. Authority was no longer a title or a position. It was a demonstration of understanding, of preparation, of patience earned over decades. What did it mean to wield that authority with calm certainty in the face of panic? It meant that the room had to choose, continue to push for compromise and risk losing integrity, or step back and witness something extraordinary unfold.
Every exchange carried weight because nothing was trivial. Questions about audience reception, box office performance, and ratings weren't dismissed, they were reframed. Clint didn't argue numbers, he reframed the narrative. The film was never about comfort or compliance, it was about consequence, about the uncomfortable truth that art has value precisely because it resists easy solutions. In that moment, every objection, every suggestion for softening the ending only underscored the contrast between safety and meaning. The executives felt the pressure, not because Clint was loud or aggressive, but because his calm refusal left them with a stark choice: continue to protect their assumptions or trust someone who had spent a lifetime understanding the consequences of getting it wrong. And here lies the essence of confrontation. It isn't chaos, it isn't volume, it isn't conflict for its own sake. It's clarity, it's conviction, it's the courage to present a choice so undeniable that panic is the only natural reaction. Clint's confrontation with the studio was not a performance, it was a demonstration of principle. It was the quiet, unshakable assertion that truth matters more than comfort, and that the cost of compromise often outweighs the cost of standing firm. In that room, for that moment, the ideological heart of the story was revealed. Art versus commerce, meaning versus profit, courage versus compliance. And the lesson for anyone listening is simple yet profound. Sometimes the calmest voice carries the heaviest weight, and the right choice is rarely the easiest one to defend. Ask yourself this: when have you truly reached a moment where compromise isn't an option, where the path forward demands that you stake everything on what you believe is right? That's exactly where Clint Eastwood stood, not with anger or bravado, but with quiet, unshakable clarity. This was the point of no return, the moment when hesitation would have meant surrender, when bending even slightly would have erased the very purpose of the story he had waited decades to tell. And in that room, every person present felt the weight of that declaration, because it wasn't a threat, it was certainty, and certainty in the face of fear is far more unsettling than any outburst. He didn't justify, he didn't negotiate, he simply stated the truth. The film would be released exactly as he intended, or it wouldn't be released at all. That simple binary, laid down with absolute conviction, carried a weight that no argument about marketability, ratings, or audience comfort could counter. In that moment, every executive had to confront a question they'd never been trained to answer. Would they force compromise and risk the integrity of the work, or would they step back and allow truth to prevail? How often in your own life do you face a choice like that, where acquiescing might feel safe, but it slowly erodes the values you claim to hold? Commitment bias is subtle but powerful. Once Clint made that choice, he had already aligned every future action with it. There was no retreat, no retraction, no hesitation. And that alignment amplified the tension because it forced everyone else to reckon with the reality that he would not waver. You can see it not as stubbornness, but as integrity in motion, the kind of integrity that signals to everyone around you what matters most. People often say don't burn bridges, but sometimes the bridge itself leads to compromise, and the real courage is in walking away rather than allowing your principles to be undermined. High stakes sharpen perception. Every objection, every suggestion to soften, every concern about audience response was reframed by the silent ultimatum. The room felt it. If you push now, you risk more than a movie. You risk trust, authenticity, and the authority of a lifetime of work. Clint understood that risk intimately, yet he accepted it, not with recklessness, but with a calm that only comes from knowing your purpose deeply. What does it teach us about taking responsibility for the work that matters, about the rare moments where you must declare without ambiguity what you will and will not allow? And here's the subtle genius. Declaring your line in the sand doesn't require aggression. It requires presence, clarity, and the ability to make others feel the gravity of a choice without forcing it. By holding firm, Clint communicated not just his personal commitment, but the essential truth of the story itself. In life, as in art, there are moments when you can hedge, negotiate, or postpone, and there are moments when you must stand, quietly, firmly, and irrevocably. That's what this was. That's what defines the difference between compromise that feels safe and courage that changes everything. And when you reflect on your own choices, isn't it worth asking which of them truly deserve that level of commitment?